Hi, my name is Andrew. For over 40 years, I lived a mostly subsistence life in ever wilder places, from the mountains of New Mexico to the interior of Alaska, 200 miles from the nearest road. What I learned during those years in the wild is not new. It's something indigenous peoples everywhere have learned through lifetimes of intimacy with wild nature. At my age, I can no longer live such a demanding life alone in the bush, but I still long for wild places. This series, Wilderness, Civilization, and Madness, is about humanity's alienation from the natural world and the consequences this has had for our cultures, our political and economic institutions, and our viability as a species. For more than 99% of our 2.5 million year evolutionary history, we humans lived in the natural world. Wild nature was the primary context, catalyst, and constituent of our evolution. The composition of the earth and our development amongst other life made us who we are today. The salt water of the oceans gave rise to our blood plasma, in a remarkably similar composition to seawater. Plants made the oxygen, which feeds a brain that today makes art and symphony. Tree limbs shaped the fingers and hands that now grasp tools. And when we came down from the trees, the grasslands set free our forefeet, enabling us to manipulate those tools and to carry our belongings. Wild nature is in our bones. And the animals too made us who we are. In one line of his poem, The Bloody Sire, Robinson Jeffers writes, "What but the wolf's tooth whittled so fine the fleet limbs of the antelope?" Jeffers says that the antelope's acute sense of smell, its great motion-detecting vision, and its speed were shaped not by the antelope, but by its hunter. But of course, this is only half the story. The fleet limbs of the antelope also whittled the wolf. Each spurred the other on to greater complexity and adaptability. Each has been locked into an evolutionary dance with the other. And so too it's been with us humans. To a large degree, much of who we are is because of our 2 million year hunting past. When we began eating meat and later learned to cook our food, a more concentrated form of energy became available to us with less work. Eating exclusively raw plants, as we had in our early evolution, required of us a greater expenditure of both time and energy in finding and eating our food. Chimps today, for example, spend much of their day foraging and chewing. It's not as if a raw plant diet isn't nutritious, it's just that, at least for our ancestors, it took more time and energy to get at that nutrition. It takes far less effort today to live on a raw or vegetarian diet, only because of modern farming, processing, and transportation. The human brain uses 20 times the energy of the equivalent amount of muscle. And meat, especially cooked meat, is packed with more usable nourishment in the form of protein and fat. This denser form of energy meant our bodies could spend more of those calories and amino acids on building a bigger brain. But just as importantly, it gave us the extra hours to sit around the campfire and refine our tools, our language, and our collaborative skills. Language, of course, made it possible for us to pass on this knowledge to our progeny. As these faculties in us grew, our way of hunting changed. 2 million years ago, individual hominids hunted mostly local small animals. 1 million years ago, groups of humans began to hunt ever larger and more dangerous animals farther afield. This way of hunting changed because of more efficient tools, greater navigation skills, and expanding language and cooperation. And all of it was shaped by and shaped an ever-enlarging brain. Who we are as humans, our huge frontal cortex and reasoning ability, our social, and even our moral characteristics came into existence through this 2 million-year hunting environment. It was the rabbit, the deer, and the mammoth that shaped the human body and mind. The word we use for wild nature, wilderness, has been laden with unfortunate meanings, connotations, and sentiments throughout much of civilized history. The root of the word will comes from the Teutonic and Norse languages and means self-willed or uncontrollable. In the Judeo-Christian Bible, the word eremos was translated as wilderness, and its meaning as uncultivated wasteland, or alternatively as a marriage in which the husband withholds his, shall we say, cultivation. In any case, eremos did not have any cheerful meanings. For the past 5,000 years or so, civilized folk have conjured some very odd stories about wilderness and its relationship to us humans. In these stories, wild nature, rather than revered as it had been in pagan and indigenous cultures, was instead despised and feared. For instance, of the nearly 300 references to wilderness that occur in the Bible, all are negative, and at no time connote anything like a fun place to be. Its opposite, Eden, in several different religions brings to mind anything but wild nature, but instead evokes images of a beautifully cultivated garden, a place without want or misery, where fruit hang off every tree, where there's neither fear nor want, where the lion lies down with the lamb and together they eat soy bacon and not dogs. It's a place where you can sit on your well-upholstered butt with no stress or worry about bypass surgery. In this Eden, God provides all of life's necessities. When he banishes Adam and Eve from this paradise for having eaten fruit of the wrong tree, it's to a place that is bleak, desolate, and unwelcoming. In other words, into the wilderness, a place where Adam and Eve's descendants would now have to settle the land and till the soil by the sweat of their brows. For some of civilization's greatest intellectuals, like Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, wilderness was a scary place where you encounter half-human satyrs, centaurs, and the forest god Pan, who after his long reign of terror in the Greek countryside, left in our language the word panic. And for the well-informed city folk of the European Middle Ages, the wild forests of Britain were the haunts of all sorts of demons and spirits, God-forsaken places where nature-worshipping heathens lived, and the place where the storied wild man who devoured their children and deflowered their pubescent daughters might be encountered. In the sophisticated cities of Scandinavia, people believed that the devil and other fallen angels had been banished into their country's forests and then transmogrified into wood sprites and trolls. Oh yeah, there were trolls long before the internet. The pilgrims and pioneers trying to make a new life in America didn't care much for wilderness either. Cotton Mather, Puritan minister, rescuer of human souls from the witches of Salem, educated at the beacon of North American civilization, Harvard, and who incidentally has a homepage on the internet these days, believed that living in the wilderness was a low condition in which people lived dangerously close to the savage or animal state, a condition that might sometimes be necessary, nevertheless was a, quote, stage through which we are passing to the promised land. Furthermore, he wrote about dragons, droves of devils, and fiery-flying serpents out in the God-forsaken wilderness. Did I mention he was educated at Harvard? Another pilgrim, William Bradford, who was in Dutch with his fellow religious countrymen in Holland, wasn't exactly happy with the idea of having to disembark the Mayflower in such a, quote, hideous and desolate wilderness as Cape Cod. Nowadays, Cape Cod is much more cultured and genteel than when the Mayflower first landed, and perhaps better tolerated. underscoring again that civilization has not been too keen on wild nature. In fact, the measure of a civilization has been mostly the measure of its detachment from the natural world. The closer to nature, the closer to savagery and the devil. These days, few civilized folk believe that demons and ogres roam the wild, except for maybe Bigfoot evangelists. But for many, wilderness is still seen as a sparse and dangerous place, where menacing bears and snakes lurk, where creepy insects are out to sting you, where it's dark at night, where serial killers dump the bodies, where there are no late-night restaurants or art galleries or even self-service, and where you can be in deep doo-doo if your emergency GPS locator runs out of battery. In any case, they might ask you why you'd want to go out there and sweat or freeze or get lost when you can have your adventure more safely via proxy, sitting in your recliner, frosty pale ale in hand, watching others on the flat screen taking on that survival challenge naked in the Siberian taiga in January. Native people too hated what the white man called wilderness, but of course it wasn't the uncontrolled natural world they hated, it was the white man's scornful word for the land they loved. Chief Standing Bear of the Ogallala Sioux explained, "We did not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills and winding streams with tangled growth as wild. Only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us it was tame. Earth was bountiful, and we were surrounded with the blessings of the great mystery." In the 17th century, during the so-called Enlightenment period, Thomas Hobbes had a very different view of the natural world than indigenous folk. He maintained that a life in the condition of mere nature was poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Maybe he meant poor, nasty, British, and short. I knew someone like that once. Another Enlightenment philosopher, John Locke, asserted that 99% of the value of nature is made by human labor, that humans create virtually all the worth of the natural world, that unless nature is transformed by people, removed from the commons and made personal property, he claims it has no value. I imagine that 17th century London, with its skies blackened with coal soot and smog, streets swarming with bubonic rats, and the stench of a shit-infested river Thames, is perhaps more like what Locke had in mind as value. I wonder what Standing Bear would have thought of the wisdom radiating from the Enlightenment. Most people in Western culture, of course, viewed wilderness from the perspective of their domesticated and urban and agricultural surroundings. Nature was sometimes thought beautiful and inspiring, but then only in its pastoral and rural forms. In its wild state, it was still considered hideous, if possible, overcome and transformed into something useful. In other words, into real estate. It wasn't till the 19th and 20th centuries, when wild nature was mostly subdued, that civilization began to value wilderness. What had been seen by Western culture as vile, dirty, and chaotic had been mostly vanquished. Parks are for people, they now began to say. But this was, for the most part, not the numinous regard that native people had for the natural world, but rather a recreational or aesthetic appreciation. Wilderness was now something to be enjoyed rather than hated, but not quite venerated the way pagans or indigenous folk had. Just as in John Locke's view, wild nature remained little more than an object waiting to be made into value through human use, even if only recreational use. Yet around the same time, there were hints of a new story beginning to emerge in civilized circles about humanity's deeper, more vital ties to the natural world. One backed not by fanciful stories, but by scientific evidence. Around 200 years ago, Wolfgang von Goethe wrote, "No living thing is unitary in nature. Everything is a plurality," he said, "dependent on the integrity of some part. Even the organism which appears to us as an individual exists as a collection of independent living entities." Wow, now that was some pretty amazing insight for someone so many years ago. But I suppose even a civilized person can sometimes stumble upon an idea that many indigenous folk have always had. In the next 2 centuries after Goethe's light bulb moment, at least a half dozen different sciences, geology, biology, genetics, paleontology, molecular chemistry, and ecology, have verified the human connection to other life. Under the microscope, we've seen that the microorganisms that live in our bodies, bacteria, fungi, and archaea, outnumber our own so-called human cells. They live on top of and in our skin, in our saliva, our oral mucosa, and in our guts. Without them, we could not be. Sometimes different forms of life become so intertwined that together they become a new higher order organism. Geneticist Lynn Margulis, for instance, discovered that mitochondria, the power generators of our own bodies, were once free-living bacteria, which were incorporated into our cells many millions of years ago. She found their wild relatives still living as independent organisms today. Even some of the viruses that once infected us are part of the human genome and now constitute something like 8% of our DNA. Not only has science shown that we are connected to, but also that we have evolved from and hence are related to other life. In our genome are the suppressed remnants of extra nipples and hair all over our bodies. In our fetuses, the vestiges of tails. We share 98% of the genes of a chimpanzee, 70% of the genes of a zebrafish, 40% of the genes of a banana. In the same way that different forms of life constitute our physical bodies, so we too, along with other life, constitute the larger whole that is the Earth. Separately, no single part of the living planet can survive, but together we add up to a more complex, higher-order form of life. We humans are but small parts of this larger Earth body, in the same way that our liver or pancreas cells are in relation to our own anatomy. Humans, however, are one type of cell in the body of the Earth that has decided its kind is in charge of the entire system, and the rest of the body is merely raw material for its own use. Once in a while, perhaps due to a mutation, such cells do occur in our own bodies and attempt to take over the entire anatomy. We call such cells cancer. And it's ironic that cancer is a disease of modernity because it's a metaphor for the modern human relationship to the planet. Human civilization, its populations, and its plunder of Earth systems will, like cancer, probably continue to grow, perhaps even magnificently for a while. Then likely it will kill its host, and along with it, us. The Suquamish chief Seattle saw this more than 150 years ago. Man did not weave the web of life, he said. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. And we called these people savages